here today. I am Paul Marty, professor in the School of Information, delighted to be the chair of the Faculty Steering Committee for the Carothers Lecture Series. We have a number of steering committee members here in the room. Thank you so much for all of your help. The papers on the table in front of you, if you've not been to one of these before, give a brief introduction overview to this lecture series, which is the longest running interdisciplinary lecture series at FSU, dating back to the early 1980s. It's a really great series. Many thanks, of course, to the Office of Faculty Development and Advancement, the University Libraries, and the Office of Research for generously sponsoring the series and paying for the lunch and providing the space. We will be back next year, 2024, 2025. We are working on the schedule right now. I'm delighted to let you know, and I did put it in here, as I was able to confirm that we will have some crossover events next year. We will be crossing over with the Office of Research's Discovery Days in October, which we have last, and we will also be crossing over with the Festival of the Creative Arts, which is Ian Quinn's thing, right? Which is also spectacular. It is Ian Quinn's thing, right? I can say that? Okay, great. So that'll be in February, so it's going to be a lot of fun to have some crossover events between this lecture series and those events there. So I hope to see you at all of those once we get the information together. I think that's all that I have to convey. So without further ado, I'm going to invite Dr. Amy Baker-Taylor up here, Professor of Oceanography, to introduce our guest speaker. Amy, thank you so much.
Thank you, Paul. Hello, everyone. I'm happy to introduce you today to Dr. Mariana Fuentes, who is an associate professor in the EOAS department in the Oceanography program, and actually an honest, she'll be a full professor. Yeah. And she joined our department in 2015. She's also the director and founder of the Marine Turtle Research, Ecology, and Conservation Group here at FSU. She completed her PhD at James Cook University, where she began working on sea turtles, assessing the impacts of climate change on sea turtles, and for her postdoc, she undertook a prestigious super science postdoctoral fellowship at the Australian Research Council Centre for Excellence for Coral Reef Studies in Australia. She's been involved with sea turtle research and conservation for more than 20 years and has established a very dynamic sea turtle research program that focuses on providing the critical science to aid in conservation and management of sea turtles. The results of her research have allowed managers and decision makers to better anticipate and mitigate impacts to sea turtles and to identify stressors to help improve their overall health. She has also informed the design of conservation areas and critical habitats and the implementation of conservation actions. Her work is internationally recognized. She is an invited member of the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, the IUCN you may have heard of, as a marine turtle specialist, and she's also an active member of the Sea Turtle Society, where she serves as director of the International Sea Turtle Society Board. Her long list of awards include a Rising Star by the Academy of Science, Engineering, and Medicine of Florida, the Developing Scholar Award here at FSU, a fellowship from the National Academy of Sciences for work in the Gulf of Mexico, a Young Explorer Award from the National Geographic Society, the prestigious Young Tall Poppy Science Award, which is an Australian award, and the Sharing Science Award from the American Geophysical Union. So I'm happy to introduce you.
Use the mic. Yeah, if you can hold it on. Thank you.
All right, can you guys hear me? It is on?
I don't think the mic's actually kicked in yet.
It's good, it's good.
It is good?
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you, Amy, for the introduction, and thank you so much for the invitation to be here today. I do apologize, I'm a little bit short, but hopefully you can see me and hear me at the same time. So my presentation today is going to focus on opportunities to conserve marine species in a changing world, and I'll be mainly focusing on how my lab has provided science-based solutions for the conservation and management of species of conservation concern. So, as we all know, the ocean is home to thousands of species which rely on specific conditions to survive. However, our oceans have been heavily impacted by human activities and are now overexploited, polluted, and experiencing changes in temperature, acidity, and oxygen levels. Similarly, coastal areas, which also provide important habitat for some marine species, have also been heavily modified and impacted by human activities. So all these changes to coastal marine environments are impacting species that rely on these habitats. So to highlight this here, and hopefully you can see, Here I'm presenting the threat levels of different groups of migratory marine species. But basically, in a nutshell, about 36% of marine mammals, 6 out of the 7 species of sea turtles, and 16% of sharks are now threatened. And this basically means that they are either vulnerable, endangered, or critically endangered, and they experience different probabilities of becoming extinct with the next 50 to 100 years. So to address this, the goal of my research program is to determine how different human activities and stressors are impacting species of conservation concern, and to provide science-based solutions to inform their management and conservation. So our work focuses mainly on sea turtles, but because the approaches that we use and ecological questions that we address are relevant to a variety of taxa and systems, we also work with other marine megafauna. But today I'll be focusing on the work that we have done on sea turtles, and I'll be providing some examples on how we have used novel approaches to determine the impacts of different stressors in sea turtles, and how we use systematic conservation planning to inform their management and conservation. So to inform the management and conservation of species, we first need to determine their exposure to different stressors. However, to do this, we need to determine their spatial distribution, identify key habitats, critical resources, and discrete aggregations. So then we can explore how those areas are impacted by different stressors. However, when determining the spatial distribution of species that spend most of their life underwater and are highly migratory can be quite challenging. So one of the ways that we can obtain information on the spatial distribution of such animals is by deploying satellite tags on them. So here you can see a figure of a loggerhead turtle with a satellite tag, and basically every time this animal comes to the surface, the tag sends a signal to a satellite, and this provides information on their location. And then with this information, we're able to determine the spatial distribution and to identify areas that are critical for their survival. So for the last decades, I have been satellite tagging different species of sea turtles globally, and this has allowed me to identify their spatial distribution, to identify critical areas for their survival, and also to inform the management and conservation of those species. So here we have an example of how we use data from satellite tagged turtles in the southeast coast of Brazil. And basically the idea behind this project was, one, to identify important foraging areas for turtles. And if you look at panel A, I know you can't, if you're not familiar with the coast of Brazil, it's hard, but the idea behind here is that we're able to identify areas that were important for green turtles in this region. And then after that, we wanted to look at the exposure of those areas to different anthropogenic stressors. So in this case, we looked at the stressors from marine traffic, ports, and artisanal fisheries. So basically, this allowed us to identify the anthropogenic activities that provide the greatest risk to marine turtles. And in this case, it was artisanal fisheries and marine traffic. And it also allowed us to identify threat areas that required local management intervention to protect marine turtles in this region. So similarly here, we have a different case study of a project undertaken in the northeast coast of Brazil. And the idea here was to use data on the spatial distribution of turtles to assess the effectiveness of marine protected areas. So we wanted to know how well current marine protected areas were protecting post-nesting hawksbill turtles. So basically here, we undertook a similar approach to the previous project, and we identified high-use areas for hawksbill turtles in the northeast coast of Brazil, and that's identified on panel A, on the different shades of orange and yellow. And then we looked at the exposure of those areas to different human activities, and here we considered artisanal fishery, marine traffic, industrial fishery, ports, and mining. So after we looked at this, we also looked at the exposure of those areas to marine protected areas. And we found a huge mismatch between areas used by turtles and areas that are protected, with over 88% of the areas used by turtles not being protected. More alarmingly, we also found that the few areas that were protected they were still being exposed to different anthropogenic activities. In this case, mainly artisanal fishery. So this project actually provided information to guide current and future management strategies in Brazil. So ideally, information, the spatial distribution of species should be used prior to the implementation of marine protected areas, right? So this would hopefully allow us to better design marine protected areas. So this was the case for this project here. So here we used information, the spatial distribution of species, to inform and to design future marine protected areas. So the idea behind this project was to maximize the conservation of green turtles in the Bahamas while minimizing impacts to society. So to do this, we collected information, the spatial distribution of turtles. We also collected information on the areas that are most important for them, and we collected information on the areas that are being used by different stakeholders, like fishermen. So all this information was put into this systematic conservation planning program called MARCSEN, and basically we're able to run different scenarios assuming different conservation targets. So we could say, what areas should we protect if we want to protect 20, 30, 50% of the areas that are important for sea turtles. And so basically on the top panel here, there's different scenarios that we ran, and basically we provided different conservation targets. And in the bottom, we basically ran the same scenarios, but we said, what area should we protect additionally to already protecting the northern part of this island? And the reason why we wanted to keep the northern part of this island protected is because this area we know to be important for sharks. So we wanted to think about a multi-species management approach. So basically here's just to highlight how we can use spatial data to inform the design of marine protected areas. And you can see on the darker shades in each of the scenarios, those are the areas that have been suggested more often to be good candidates for protection to maximize conservation of species while minimizing impact to society. So spatial data on species can also be helpful to look at how they're being impacted by different stressors. In this case, we're interested on how recreational fisheries are impacting the spatial distribution of sea turtles. And this work was conducted in the Panhandle of Florida and Crystal River. And this region is important for different species of sea turtles, but it also is important as recreational scallop fisheries during the summer months. So basically here, we compare the spatial distribution of turtles before the scallop season, which is highlighted in blue on panel A, with the spatial distribution of turtles during the scallop season, which is in orange. And basically what you can see is that during the scallop season, sea turtles spread out their spatial distribution. And when we compare that to the density of vessels on panel B, you can see that they're tending to go to areas that have less distribution of vessels. So this gives us some indication of how they're responding to the presence of boaters. So when we're thinking about protecting species of conservation concern, not only we need to understand their exposure to different stressors, but we also need to understand the impact that those stressors have on species. So for the last few years, we have been interested in understanding the impacts that vessel interactions have on sea turtles. We know that interactions between vessels and sea turtles can cause severe injuries to turtles and can kill the turtles. And indeed, between 2010 and 2022, over 6,000 turtles have been stranded in Florida with vessel strike injuries. However, we know a lot less about the non-lethal impacts from vessel interactions on turtles, and we think that basically the interactions between turtles and vessels can cause impacts to the energy expenditure of turtles. It can cause changes in their foraging activities. It can result in displacement, and this can have long-term effects to their growth rates and reproductive output. So in order to address this question, we again are working in Crystal River, and as I mentioned before, this is an important foraging area for green, loggerhead, and Camp's Ridley turtles. And it also supports an important recreational scallop fishery during the summer months. So to try to get a better sense of the fine scale impact of interactions between vessels and turtles, we have been deploying this CAT scan, which are those devices in orange over there. So basically they're very, very fancy and expensive GoPro, and they have a camera, and they also have multiple sensors that provide information on the pitch, row, heading, depth, received underwater sound, temperature, and location of an animal. So to date, we have conducted 24 deployments of 24 hours. So this has been amazing to give us some insights into the secret lives of sea turtles. And we have obtained a plethora of data and a lot of different insights into how sea turtles are interacting with other species and also with different stressors. So here we have a video from one of those deployments, and you can see a really close call between a turtle and a vessel. So unfortunately, we have seen several footage that reflect this one. All the deployments that we have conducted, most of them we have seen interactions between turtles and vessels. But now we're able to look at this footage, get the timestamp from the footage, and combine this with the data from the different sensors to get a better insight into how those interactions are impacting the fine-scale behavior of individuals and the consequence to energy expenditure, foraging ecology, and the cascading effects to the whole ecosystem. So we're still analyzing this data, but I just wanted to showcase an example of the data set that we get from those deployments. So basically in panel A, we have the dive profile of the animal. On panel B, we have the dynamic body acceleration, which is a proxy for energy expenditure. Panel C, we have the rotation activity, which is a proxy for their direction. And panel D, we have information on the sound that turtles are experiencing, which also allows us to identify boat passes. So sometimes we can't see the boats from the footage, but we can hear the boats, so we know that they're interacting with vessels. So hopefully, as we analyze this data, we have better insights into how they're being impacted. But for now, I just wanted to showcase this so that you guys can have an idea of some of the work that we're doing. So when we're thinking about impacts to species of conservation concern, climate change is one of those impacts that come to mind. And sea turtles are thought to be particularly vulnerable to climate change. They have life history traits tied to environmental variables, and they nest in coastal areas that are prone to sea level rise and storm activities. So this figure here is from a recent review that we conducted on the knowledge basis of the impacts of climate change on sea turtles. And basically what you can see is that the different life stages of sea turtles will be impacted by different climatic processes across their oceanic and terrestrial environments. So my lab has been particularly interested in how increasing temperature will impact the reproductive output of sea turtles. And the reason for this is because temperature plays a vital role on sea turtle embryo development and hatchling success. So in order for sea turtle eggs to incubate, they need to incubate within a narrow thermal range. Anything above or below this will cause the eggs not to develop and they'll die. In addition to this, sea turtles have temperature-dependent sex determination, and this means that the sex of their hatchlings is determined by the sand temperature, with warmer temperatures producing more females and cooler temperature producing more males. So to determine the impacts that increasing temperature can have on sea turtles' reproductive output, I have been monitoring the thermal profile of sea turtle nesting grounds for the last decades. And we have used this information with models that we developed that look at the relationship between environmental parameters and sand property to predict what the incubation environment would be like under different scenarios of climate change. And then we use this information with information on the relationship between temperature, sex ratio, and hatchling success to predict what the reproductive output of sea turtles will be under a changing climate. So my work and the work of others have predicted a feminization of sea turtle population as climate change progresses. This is what we call the bachelor's paradise. We're going to have a lot more females being produced to males. So in the short term, we think that more females means that we're going to have an increased number of eggs, and this will actually cause a growth in the population. However, if we think in the long term and the fact that we're going to have a lot less of males being produced, this might have implications for sea turtle populations. So to really understand the impacts that increasing temperature will have on sea turtle populations, we really need to understand how many males we need to sustain a sea turtle population. And this is a project that we're currently working in collaboration with the university, UMass and Oregon State University, and we're trying to address this question. So to address this question, we're working off a volcanic archipelago off the northeast coast of Brazil, and we're working with a population of green turtles. And the reason why we work in this location is because not only we have access to the nesting females, but we know where the males and females are breeding, and we have access to the males as well, but we also have access to the hatchlings that are being produced by this population. So we can get a holistic, we can holistically look at the whole population. So to address this question, we're basically taking a multifaceted approach, and we're taking advantage of biologging devices. So we're satellite tagging male turtles to get a better sense of how often they're breeding. We're also monitoring the nesting activities of female turtles to get a better sense of their reproductive output. We are also conducting in-water surveys to look at the proportion of males and females that are breeding each year. And we're looking at the genetic fingerprinting of males and females and determining their contribution to the cohort of offsprings that are being produced. So all this information is put together into a two-sex age structure model of turtle population dynamics. And basically what this allows us to do is to look at how different scenarios of climate change will impact the persistence of populations if we have different breeding sex ratios. So for example here, we need about 20% of males to be produced for populations to persist if we have 0.5 Celsius increase in temperature. So if you look at this graph, this figure, you can start to see that things get pretty dire depending on the climate scenario that we have and depending on the proportion of males that we have being produced. So this gives us more insights into how many males we actually need to sustain sea turtle populations, and obviously it's going to depend on how much our climate changes. So when we're thinking about impacts to species, we really need to think about how they can adapt to those impacts, right? When we're thinking about sea turtles and climate change, for example, we know that sea turtles have been around for millions of years, and during this time they have adapted to substantial climatic changes. So the big question now is whether depleted populations of sea turtles can adapt to faster rates of climate change. So we do think that sea turtles might adapt to climate change by shifting their nesting distribution, so they might start nesting in areas that are more climatically suitable. They might change where they nest within the nesting beach to nesting in better areas, or they might shift the timing of their nesting to align with cooler months. And this is something that we already observed here in Florida. So in order to determine if adaptive responses are going to be able to counteract predicted impacts of climate change, we basically looked at whether changes in the timing of the nesting of sea turtles would be able to counteract predicted impacts. So to look at this, we predicted nest temperature, hatchling success, and sex ratio under different scenarios of climate change. And then we looked at what this would be like if turtles shifted the timing of their nesting. So this study was conducted for different species and populations of turtles globally. And basically each dot here represents a nesting location, and each of the circles represents the proportion of females that are being produced. So the black represents the current rates of females that are being produced at each location. And I don't know if you can see, but basically most of the populations already have a female bias production. The red represents the predicted proportion of females under a certain scenario of climate change, and the blue represents the proportion of females that will be produced under the same scenario, but assuming that turtles are shifting the timing of their nesting. So basically what we can see here is that only at 4 locations turtles would be able to counteract the impacts of climate change by shifting the timing of their nesting. So basically what this tells us is that phenological shifts alone would not be sufficient to offset changes in sex ratio, and that the impacts of climate change and the ability of phenological shifts to counteract impacts will vary spatially and among species. So populations that are already nesting in the cooler parts of the year, they're going to be unable to take advantage of shifts in the timing of nesting. And also we found that nesting sites that are further from the equator may have the greatest capacity to adapt to climate change. So as I alluded to at the beginning of this presentation, species are being impacted by a multitude of stressors at the same time. As you can see here, in the case of sea turtles, they're being impacted during the terrestrial environment and in their oceanic environment. And today I provided insights on how turtles are being impacted by recreational fisheries and climate change. And our lab has looked at how other stressors have impacted marine turtles, and I'm happy to talk about those after this presentation. But basically I put this slide up because I really wanted to highlight that we need to think about the synergies and the cumulative nature of the different stressors. So we're still thinking about stressors individualistically, and we're not considering those interactions. And I'm still trying to get my head around how to deal with the synergies between different stressors. And I wanted to mention this because if there's anyone here that has a good approach or is dealing with this, I'd be happy to talk and brainstorm some ways forward. So with that, I hope that today I have demonstrated how we can use science to inform the conservation of species in a changing climate. Obviously, spatial data can help us identify key areas to protect and focus management, and novel techniques can help determine impact of stressors to species. So all this really provides key information for targeted intervention and informed conservation efforts. With this, I wanted to thank all the different sponsors and funding agencies that have provided valuable resources for the different projects that are presented today. It was really hard picking what to talk about. So if anyone wants to know more about the lab or have any questions, I'm happy to address those questions. But there's a link to our website and also a QR code to sign up for our newsletters if you're interested. And with that, I'll take any questions.
Great information. So one of the things I was wondering about early on when you talked about, you said something like 80% of the areas, like in Brazil, are not being protected. In that area and in other areas, is that just because people mainly focused on nesting areas and not really focused on the habitat, or what's the cause for the disconnect?
So in this case, it was basically because information on the spatial distribution of species was not incorporated when they designed the marine protected areas.
Okay.
So that information didn't exist.
Yeah.
And so this work, which was actually the work of current postdoc in my lab and PhD student, basically provided that information. So that if they revisit the design of protected areas, they can now use that information. And that's why it was so valuable with the work in Bimini in the Bahamas. We had this spatial data, so we could better develop marine protected areas or suggest areas for protection based on the information that we have.
Great.
So it's actually very expensive to deploy those satellite tags on turtles. They cost about $5,000 each, and you need a very large sample size because typically each turtle goes in one direction. So it's hard to get that level of information to really identify critical habitat and areas for species.
How do you identify and capture the turtles if they're not nesting to outfit them with that?
We going to take what we call rodeo technique. So we run line transects and surveys in water, and we spot the turtle. We jump on the turtle, we catch the turtle, we put them in the boat, and then we deploy the tags and we collect all the information. We have all the permitting necessary.
Yeah.
Do not
Turtles are
attempt to
not
do
easy
that.
to catch, I know, yeah, huh.
I have a question about, do they have, when they're nesting, is there like site fidelity, like salmon always go back to the same river? Do turtles try to go back to the same nesting areas?
Yes, yeah, they go back to the same region. We used to think they go back to the same beach, and some species and populations do, but it's generally within the same area.
So they do have some adaptive capacity, but if that's going to be limited. They can't, if they're not going to go from Crystal River to Pensacola to nest, or do they?
I mean, they don't net, like Crystal River is in waterside and it's like all mangroves there, but like the turtles nesting at St. George Island, for example, have been caught nesting near Sarasota, for example.
Oh, okay.
So it's the same region.
But it's
basically.
still a pretty broad area.
Yeah, a broad area.
I got one other question. Oh, sorry,
Oh,
so
just
behind
one back
Paul,
and then we can go.
because I don't have mine in the back of my head.
I was just gonna ask what kind of information you can get from like the noise of the boat. Can you get the speed of the boats, or is it just like the proximity of the boats? And can you use that noise to help inform like, minimum boat speeds and stuff?
So that's a good question because, yeah, understanding noise underwater is really hard. So we can get, and I'm not about acoustic, and we're collaborating with someone for this part of the project, but basically we can get the magnitude and we can try to infer the size of the boat and the distance, but it's iffy. But we also get some really cool data from other species that are in the region as well.
Yeah, I understand that with the warming of the environment, there are a lot more females being hatching. Do we have an idea of what the current populations are, the proportions of male and female?
So, yes, that's a good question. So they're female biased already, but the one issue that we have with sea turtles, we can't tell a male from a female until they reach sexual maturity. So we don't really know what's happening in the sub-adult juvenile stages. We only know what's happening when they're, so it's hard really to say, but we think they're already female biased. Another question.
Well, so I was thinking about that and the effect of temperature on them and so on. So, and I know there's diseases and all sorts of things, but I mean, in an area where the water temperature is, let's say, high enough to produce a large number of males, there's a strong likelihood that's going to happen. I mean, could you take the eggs from the nest and relocate them to another area before they hatch where you expect a lot of females are going to be and just artificially introduce males to diversify it?
I mean, you could. There's lots of different strategies that have been suggested, like cooling the nest or sprinkling the nest or shading the nest. But I think the big question, well, the things to consider is the ethical aspect of that, manipulating the environment, and also the feasibility and cost, right? Like, what scale are you going to do that at? If you think of a nesting beach in Florida and what you need to do for the whole population of sea turtles, to be producing enough males to sustain that population.
Yeah. Huh. Fascinating. Well, who doesn't love turtles? Right?
Do we have any more questions? Well, if not, to move this out of the way. Okay. If not, on behalf of the Carothers Lecture Faculty Steering Committee, I'm delighted to present you with this beautiful mug, which has in it a gift card to Calvin's Coffee Shop, which is a connection back to the historical origins of this series. So with that, please join me in thanking Mariana for this magnificent. I learned a lot about turtles, and now I have questions about training turtles as well. We have a lot of box turtles that live in our neighborhood, and they can be trained. So yes, thank you all so much for coming here. Look forward to seeing you next semester, and have a great summer, everyone. Thanks.